we messed with it. We'll go from beginning, right?
Yeah.
There we go. So I would always have to start by saying Lumagwachwigo, which is thanks to all of you for inviting me here and all of the people that you named that make that possible. I know it's never just one person that brings someone to a place. The other thing that we would also traditionally do is acknowledge where we are, which for me is particularly fun because where I am now is where the Anishinaabe migrated to. So our people were once farther east, so maybe we were here a long, long, long time ago. I would introduce myself saying Meg Noodin, which she alluded to a little bit. So my Anishinaabe name I've always had in communities. When I'm working in teaching, I get called Meg Noodin, which is north wind, so really I don't mind the weather at all. So Meg Noodin, Digo. Wabje Shin de Bendigas, the clan that I associate with is the Martin clan, and you'll have to look up what a little pine martin is. They are typically thought of as really, really busy and warrior type people, and so I think it's probably no surprise that I have Teachers for Parents and went into language activism and teaching myself. I would also usually use a fair amount of the language just so people get used to hearing it. So Opchigo to get Chanandam, Gabitago Shiniak Mampi, Uniota Aking. And it's something that it's really glad to see so many people here. I'm happy that you're all in this place. What I have here, so Oniota, that's the one that you guys are familiar with. The Gabe Gikandaso Gamegong is how we say university or college, large school. What it actually means is a place where learning happens forever. So that's the word that we use for university. And then we've just added, because I was reminded by the beautiful image, Miskoshkore Kade Ganebek. I could have said Miskoshkore Nagwigane Kade Ganebek, but that might have been a little too long. Red dragon. So what it really just says is a red fire-breathing lizard. If we want to talk about wings and tails, we could add that too. So what I'll share with you a little bit is how the work that I do crosses a couple of different places, which I think is very traditional. So the Anishinaabe people always moved. And it wasn't a matter of being nomadic. It's a matter of being in the place that you need to be at the right time. So if it's winter, you hunker down and you tell stories. So it's good you guys are here. We're just telling stories tonight. But then when it gets to be spring, you go out and there's a place that you go. And when it's summer, there's a maybe different place that you go. And when there's fall, another place that you go. So that moving around and being in the place that you need to be in isn't actually lost. For me now, it's a matter of moving between the lives of the kids and parents that I work on revitalizing Anishinaabe language with, to when I go and I teach Native literature courses, to doing linguistics work and trying to analyze what is the history of our language and the connections between words, and trying to write poetry. So I'll try to explain how all those little places make one sort of connected path for you. This is what we would call Anishinaabe Yaki. It's nice that I'm also in a place where the Great Lakes make sense. They're familiar to you. A little while ago I was in Albuquerque. It's a little harder to get in their minds what are the Great Lakes. But for us, what's very interesting, I put on the slide one of the most important things that I think a lot of people don't know, that for thousands of years people have been speaking indigenous languages on this continent. They probably go back in layers that we'll never really trace to the most original language, but the language that we have connects these places in a really interesting way. And for us, it's really important to remember that Anishinaabe is a term that we use for what's known as the Three Fires Confederacy. I think we always were a little jealous. Everybody knew about the Iroquois Confederacy. We're like, we have a confederacy, And so people would learn about these large confederacies, which is a little bit different than a nation. It's a little different than a family or a clan or a community. It's another layer, which now you guys have things like different social networks and circles and pages, and it's not a hard thing for you to understand that you can be in multiple groups at one time. And that's how your identity is formed. So for us, people were in this area, and when you look at this particular area, we would call that Chigaming. So the Michigamming is this great big interconnected sea. We learn now to memorize the word homes and spell out the names of the lake as proper nouns, but we would have called all of that. So whether you were in what's now Detroit, looking at one side of the Great Lakes, you would say Michigamming. When you were where I am now in Milwaukee, if you look at that water, you would say Michigamming. If you're where I originally was from in Minnesota, you were in Lake Superior, same thing. So in fact, even in that little beginning piece of how we define ourselves, that sense that those are connected bodies is really important. So if I'm teaching kids all in Anishinaabemowin, what is that? It isn't 5 separate proper nouns. It's actually one thing. And when we start thinking about, are those Asian carp going to come up from the bottom of Lake Michigan? Because the minute they do that, they're in the whole thing. And if we lose part of the health of those lakes, then we lose the whole system. So thinking about place through language and how we used to talk about place can be very, very useful. And also I was trying to remember to tell you guys as well that for us there's over 200 separate sovereign nations. So I grew up in Minnesota where we have multiple Ojibwe reservations. In the US we have reservations. In Canada there are First Nations. And we learned to say, well, there's the Chippewa, the Lake Superior Band Chippewa, versus maybe the Fond du Lac Chippewa, or we would say all these separate. And honestly, I kid you not, it's probably a measure of how old I am, we learned to call the Chippewa, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi. It wasn't until the late 70s that we remembered the term Anishinaabe. And now in class, when I teach about Indian history, I teach in the American Indian Studies program, and we've found a number of documents where the people back then are using the term Anishinaabe. So there was a lot of forgetting that took place. And now what we're trying to do is remember, and remember those connections. So I might have just a very small class. Right now I have 12 students in Ojibwe. But over at the Indian Community School in Milwaukee, we have 100 young students in Ojibwe. And when I taught at Michigan, we had 48 students in Ojibwe. And rather than think of those as people who are separated, we have to start remembering they're really all Anishinaabe. They actually all connect up. And if we count our sister First Nations in Canada, there's really over 200 communities that use Anishinaabemowin. The other thing to know about that, though, is most of the people are over 60 who speak the language. And we run a large conference every year to gather all the teachers and gather young students. Right now, we know of about 4 immersion schools. But for people who are in linguistics, one of the sort of sobering statistics is that of over 200 indigenous languages spoken in North America, it's predicted that within 30 years there will be only 3. And for me, as I look and I think, well, how many of us are there? There's only 5 people that I know that also teach this language anywhere. And luckily, we all got our PhDs and we're doing our best to set a good example, but only 3 of us taught our kids the language, just through circumstance and the ability to have time to do that. And even of my 2 girls, one loves it a lot, the other one's busy, she's got a lot of things. So when you start looking at the numbers, you realize how many people we need to share our language with if we want to see it. Because right now, if I just did statistics on it, I would say we won't have a language probably 25 years, because the fluent speakers won't be with us anymore. But luckily I'm not a statistician. I'm a dreamer, so we can imagine there will be a language, right? I think that it will be something different, though. And what we hope that it will become, we need to ramp up, get more people using it. And so then the first question is why? Well, why would we do this? The language disappeared. People went to boarding schools, people stopped speaking the language. Why did it happen? And it was because some of our beliefs were so connected and embedded in the language that if you want to form a new nation and you want to do your empire building, you want people to be on the same page and thinking about things the same way. And when we go back to our language, what I have to explain to folks is, sure, I'm going to teach you a whole bunch of verbs, and you're going to have to memorize, and you'll have quizzes, or you just need to practice. So younger students, I'll just say, I'm going to teach you a new song every day, and then you'll learn a lot about the language. And the reason to do that is because embedded in that language are a lot of very important concepts. This was just one example. So one of the earliest stories that we tell, and it's a good winter story, is when using the word you know. So gijewabus minoa bibunke. So when a rabbit, we have stories about Wenebojo, and when a rabbit, sometimes the stories are short, sometimes they're long, he was a person, and then he became small, and he turned into a rabbit, and he ran up to the sun, and he let his tail catch fire. And you can tell that story. I've heard elders tell that story so that it takes 4 hours, and I'm not kidding. But what you get is you get this sense, if you're hearing it in an Anishinaabe one, Wenabuju, Giankinose, Gije mi ijai wede, Gizis, and you start hearing that Gije is warmth, and Gizis is sun, and Gijagut is day, and Gijep is early. And you start hearing in the language connections that linguists would call etymology, and things that teach us about our world. And if you really sit there all day and let an elder tell your stories, you will hear that we believed the sun was the center of the universe, which is something over time to have been proven correct. You would hear that the moon is Nokomus Nabagizis. It'll be a full moon actually here in just a day or so. And that moon has certain functions that relate to the earth as the earth is going around the sun. And in these stories about a little rabbit going up to the sun, you actually can get all that in there. So you come away with a lot of astronomy, a lot of physics. There's things like Makliboganagishik, big black holes, and eclipses, and terms that we had for constellations that could teach us a lot about what you would know if you lived on this place, on this planet. So these things about creation beginning with energy, that's something in numerous stories. And I remember hearing those stories, and then it might not have been the first physics class, but the first one that I paid attention in, and I started thinking, I've heard this now. These little bits of energy, that's supposed to be everything, relates to that. And then you realize these connect back to other stories. A lot of the ways that our words work are to describe networks, and our language is about 80% verbs. Most of the time we're saying verbs. So we are sitting in a place describing what's happening. Rarely do we worry about the nouns, and most of the time the nouns are words that describe what something does. Like this is my gigadobi outcomes. It's your talking wire. Because you talk on it, and it doesn't even have a wire anymore, but you can tell what era a phone, the word was created in. And like a pen is a shabiganotic, a writing thing. So most of our nouns even are a twist on understanding that life is essentially motion. And that's something that seems very, very simple, but if we're teaching in our language and we're teaching the stories of our culture, then we get that across in a completely different way. So it's important to combine our stories and recognize their complexity and think about the science behind them. This is an example. I knew that we had some linguists in the crowd, right? A few at least. So this was an example where always, people who know me know I'm always just trying to make sure all the Anishinaabe people I know use the language, and everyone I know who's not Anishinaabe knows that we're doing it, right? That we're still here, we're using our language. So I'm on different listservs, and I run a couple websites, and I had someone email me from Berlin, and she said, we're doing a display on dying languages. I thought, well, ouch, what are you implying? Why are you talking to me? You know, we're going to put a coffin in a museum, and we want to throw 3 words into it: sun, children, and water. I thought, wow, this is where you choose. Do I want to engage or not? Because are they basically telling me to throw sun, children, and water into a coffin because my language is dying? That's a little crazy. But, you know, You have to rise to the occasion and communicate across differences. So this is what we came back with. And I always just launch in a song, she would know that. So this is what we came back with, and here's how you sing it if you guys want to know. Gijasiget gizes bina the mijike, we de bigiz a what benujiak. And we got a bunch of kids to sing it with, so we did it as a little round. Gijasiget gizes bina the mijike, we de bigiz a what benujiak. And we sang it over and over, and we recorded it, and we sent it to her, because we thought, there, it's a song, and it's a sentence, and it's verbs, and you cannot put us as nouns into a little coffin and shut it on us, because we really think this type of thing, if we can keep the language alive, and when somebody wants us to talk about children and water and the sun, what we'll remember, you guys can even see it. So when you say Gijasiget gizes, that Gijasiget and the gizes, you can see right in there that energy and warmth come from the sun. They're the same word. They're literally connected as you say them. And the fact that the children are with, so you've got Benuji, Bin Nogamijige, Bigazowat, and what's funny is nothing in there actually says bish. Literally, if someone says, on the spot, what's the noun for water? Well, bish is the noun. But the way we typically like to use the language is a verb that relates to water. So we might say menagewan, flowing stream, or bin nagamijige is to actually clean with liquid. To show that we have more than one way to say something. So this was an example of how we wanted to respond using poetry and song and celebration, and I think in the end she did move away from the coffin image. I was not the only person across the globe. There were some people in Ireland and New Zealand that also protested, and in the end I think she used the vision of a tree. And so she put words and things, and she did actually say that she used our song a little bit. The other thing is we have to teach the language. So in my lifetime, like I hope, I don't know, maybe one of you guys will come do grad school in Milwaukee when you're done here and learn the language and go teach it and do your thesis in the language. I have friends in Hawaii who teach in the language, have defended their tenure in the language, who have written extensive, large documents in the language. For us, that hasn't happened since the early 1800s. So you can find things. Warren wrote a document that was many pages long and brought it to Washington in 1820 to explain the northern Wisconsin opinion on having the Oneida move into the state. And the president at the time handed it back to him. Luckily, we still have his bilingual document, but that was the last time when things were being written in a really extended way in the language, in the early 1800s. And so now when we're trying to pull it back together, we end up having to reteach the language entirely. And one of the things we sort of learned to do was put it in a completely different framework. So there are ways to look at grammar that are linear, and for us there are ways to look at grammar that are circular. This is one that I use to try to explain to often elementary students or very busy adults. There's nothing harder to teach than a very busy grown-up, I tell you. So people come and they're like, I really want to learn my language, but they're busy and they don't have time, and they really just want to show up and have you pour it into them for an hour once a week. So we had to think of the most efficient way to do it. And in the 70s, the notion of the medicine wheel was used a lot by many different nations. So that's something that's very recent, very pan-tribal. The fact that we think in 4 directions is very old. So we have 4 types of verbs, and you can describe them in ways that are complex. You can say they are intransitive, inanimate, and use complicated linguistic terms. Or you can also use something where you visually say, just the way we have 4 directions, we have 4 verb types. And every single time you say something, you have to decide how that works. So the first verb type is to simply say, Gijasiget. It's warm, like the statement in that other song. Or you have to say wamjiget, like the example that's on there, something is seen. And then you have to take the word and twist it around. So if I want to say, I can see, as in maybe a moment ago, I was blind and couldn't, I would say, nawabam. If I say, I see the table, nawamdan. If I say, I see the woman, nawabma. And so once we start teaching people to hear those transformations, the chain of how a word changes, it made it so much simpler. Because what took me, I did not begin trying to learn the language till my late teens, and then took many, many classes where people talked at me, and I didn't really learn and could not speak. I got to actually be a very good listener and could understand and read a fair amount, but I couldn't produce my own sentences. So we actually had to spend a long time figuring out how do we most efficiently talk about what our language does. And this is just sort of the core of that. And then that was what led me to the book that I had recently finished, Bawajimo. And Bawajimo is a book where what I look at are some of our best authors. So if anybody's read Louise Erdrich's Birch Bark House, where Little Amakayas is up on Madeline Island, or recently The Round House, where she wrote about violence against women on reservations. She's taken on a lot of topics, and increasingly over time, she's put more and more language into her books. And other authors in our community have done the same thing. So in the book, what I do is actually try and look at why does that happen? How does that shift what they're doing? How does that show a little bit about who we are? And occasionally, how are people who have an Anishinaabe identity still doing some of those things like focusing on action, making connections that we see in places, even though they're doing it in English. So how do people move their identity and culture into another language? But I know you have classes where you can be assigned to read whole things, so I won't do that right now. Then the other piece that I want to make sure I have a little bit of time to share with you is the fact that if you want to have a living language, you really have to use it. So whether you're doing an SNL skit, or whether you're doing stand-up, or whether you're writing poetry, whatever it is, your thing that you do, you have to use it creatively. Because otherwise what you're doing is you're just teaching what is essentially something that could be kept in a coffin. You have to keep a language evolving and used creatively. So for me, it's writing poetry. I did an MFA a long time ago with some very fine English poets, and at the end of it I thought, oh man, that just was so uncomfortable. It just didn't work. It didn't seem like I could capture the places I knew or the sounds I wanted to represent. And so once I got much more proficient as a speaker, the last, say, 5 or 6 years, I've pretty much only written in the language. So just to give you an example, these, I'll read it both ways just so you can hear the difference. And it's a pretty literal translation, but not exact. So if we have any Anishinaabe speakers here, you'll notice the differences. Gizis gijokawan, bejik be bejik o bijishkanan, bejik be bejik o bajde bajan, Gizis gijokawan, nesesh gizongeyan, Jagashian Gashwan, Doskaviwak, Dawaniwak, Bakaknamaak, Dipkam, Bidabam, which sounds very different than warmed by the sun. One by one they are empty, one by one they are overflowing. Made warm by the sun, breath materialized, poured by maternity, eyes opening, eyes closing. They are exalted in the night, in the dawn. And one of the things that I try to write about is the things that just fascinate us. I know that a lot of people will say, well, what do Anishinaabe people want to write about? And there's a fair amount of writing about powwows and ricing and sugar bush, but this is for the stars. So the stars that are up there in relationship to the sun that we see blinking, and really that represents sort of eons of time shifts and heat changes, and the fact that for so long these ideas of the atmosphere were a part of what people talked about. So the other thing in trying to use the language and write these poems is to share an even broader view of what might be Anishinaabe poetry. I once wrote an entire translation of an excellent book called Don't Let the Pigeon Ride the Bus. is, some of you may know that line book. And I had someone tell me, but you can't do that. That's not an Indian enough story. And I thought, look, I just wrote the whole thing out for you in Anishinaabe and went, why can't we celebrate? Why can't something be Anishinaabe? So getting people to think a little bit about that is also something I like to do. So here's another little one, just so you guys can hear the difference. I don't see any of you sleeping yet, so I'll read you another one. Mi jang gidwa. Now keep in mind, the one word a lot of people know in Anishinaabe is miigwech, which is thanks. And miigwech is a conjugated form of the verb miigwe, which is to give. So in fact, when you say thanks, what you're saying is, I appreciate what you gave me. So it's like showing that reciprocity of giving. So you hear what I wanted to do is just sort of play with the idea, because the word for feather is miigwe. Because often one of the gifts that symbolize honor or recognition is when you give a feather. So if you only ever spoke Anishinaabe and you were a kid growing up and somebody says, this is a miigwan, you would hear in that word not just feather, you would hear, oh, this is a thing you give. This is a gifting thing. So, mi jangirwa, mi miigwana, mi jangirwa, mi sanajwayang o baskanawan, e pichi minajwa minet, mi dash ozawig wanewak, mi sapedek, we sapedeng, Apta matigomish, apta anang nashkon, miza matigomish, noka makadewama, anangash, adawajik, enjinawansh adawawin, ni Johnsononic, zazigandigwa, ashamangidwa, oshkin endemowen, dawin wa migadisiwat. So what we give them, or what we gave them. We gave them plumes and quills and downy tips to wear while dancing like smooth currents. They become golden feathered half-breeds in the burnt forest, part oak, part fern, solid branches, soft bracken, traders in an evolved economy. Our decorated children nourished on new ideas, possibly able to avoid old battlefields. So you can hear it in both ways, and hopefully it shifts a little bit what Anishinaabe poetry might be. So this is the last poem I'll read you tonight. And this is a really crazy one because you sometimes really have to stretch your boundaries. And I have a good friend, Hyde Eric, who talks me into doing embarrassing things. I'm sure you all have one friend like that somehow catches you doing things you never thought you would do. So she convinced me to be on stage in a play where I would have to sing blues in Ojibwe and then talk about a woman who was doing a dance as if she were a liver. Think about that. That was stretching boundaries. But it was because so many Native communities, the liver is the organ that colonization impacted the most. So when you think of people not being able to process the food or the chemicals that are in the environment now, that will impact the liver. So a lot of people have relatives who have issues with their liver. Or if the tradition of shkodeabo, the tradition of drinking, is too strong in a community and people drink and drink to the point where they can't filter that anymore, it's their liver. So she was doing this entire dance representing how Native communities have really at the core been impacted. So my friend Gordon Henry had written a little bit about Native literature and how every little piece of what you see adds up to what you know. And I thought, well, this dance about the liver, I should write a poem for this, right? These are words I should know. They're not the words you normally teach in a language class, but they were good words for me to remember how to say. And so now you can hear how some of them rhyme a little bit. Odeng. Nde gogi odeng. Okanamaning. Omisadong. Anda konegeon niu. Wina bagadendamoyan winzobi. Ja o dodoasiwang. Ja fonanagishing. Jigwaning. Gindasaman wigikendaman misguevin. Gasiabawe ingodos midna deba awan pane. Okanego nikanak eyon eyak na. Apta etigikenda nisawe neseying. So into a heart. I'm diving into a heart, a liver, a stomach, changing my body with pancreal disinterest through kidneys, intestines, to the bladder, counting what I know in my veins, washing reality through me into a 60% foggy forever. We are bone cousins, yes? Each knowing half between breaths. So every now and then, you have to stretch your limits. I don't think I could begin dancing, but I can at least write in different directions. And then this, if you can see, every author that you meet has to occasionally mention their kids. So this is my daughter, Fiona Ndana Siwede. So all of these people are in a drum group that we've got, Misquasaning Nugamojik, which started out as a language table because these busy women said, we want to use the language at home. And they would come every week, and I would say, you need to go home and memorize these words. And did they? Did they do their homework? No, they did not. Because they said, oh, my mother's in hospice. My husband lost his job. My kids got ill. And they had a lot of really good reasons. And so we thought, well, what are we going to do? So we started writing songs. So Misquasaning, Misqua is the word for blood and the word for the color red. And it's also, Misquasaning is a swamp. It's where the earth sort of bleeds. Which if you think about, maybe not that you want to, but if you think about how babies are born and how they have this sort of swampy place that nourishes them and then they come out of the water. And so these are words that are very women-like words. And two of the people in the group were nurses. So they said, you know what, let's do something that just makes us feel better. We can't remember your verbs and your lists and your quizzes. We just want to do something to make us feel better. So we started coming up with these songs. And it was the only way I could get them to remember vocabulary and conjugate. And now, some of them, I'll see them in the store, and they'll say, oh, kawab-nago, kawab-nanim. They'll remember their different verb endings because we sang them in songs. So it's a good lesson that no one is too old to learn. Dory isn't pictured here, but our oldest group member is in her 80s. She's 88 now. And our youngest group member, actually Shayla, there's another group member not shown, she's 5. And they all can stand there and sing the songs. This one is one that we started when Idle No More was really big. If you guys remember hearing about Idle No More, which started when in Canada there was one particular community where the tribal chief wanted to go on a hunger strike and raise awareness to a variety of political changes and issues. And one of the ways that they brought attention to it was just to sing. So we would get friends on Facebook telling us, go down into Detroit and just have an Idle No More round dance. And we'd think, okay, well, then we need a round dance song, right? So this was our round dance song. And it traces back, we always have a story with every song, and it traces back to the 1970s when Native women were in prison in Kingston, Ontario. And the prison there, they would keep them in separate areas and they were told they couldn't talk, so the women would sing to each other. In the 70s, though, most women, some of those women were primarily Mohawk women who were protesting that they lost their citizenship when they married outside of the tribe, yet when men married outside of the tribe, the women they married became citizens of the Mohawk Nation. So that was something worth protesting, but they got thrown in prison, and it was a period in our history where most people weren't still using the language. So what they sang was what was called just vocables. And we started putting words to things. So we put words to the tune those women sang to each other to just tell each other they were there when they were in solitary confinement. And if I had time, I would teach you guys all to sing it, because most of our songs have back and forth and places where people are supposed to come in. I'll sing it for you so you know how it goes. But the way that it loops around, I'll sing it just twice so that you can hear it. Typically, you would have people in groups coming in over on top of each other in layers, just to say. And I think that's something also when you look at the history of performance and ceremony, a lot of early ethnography about our language and culture would focus on what were those savages doing, and they thought everything was a god. And they wouldn't necessarily think, oh, they're practicing psychological meditation and they're healing because they're getting their mind off of other things and they have to focus. So some of the things in our songs where they have complex patterns, the outcome is you really have to push everything out of your mind and focus on it to get it right and harmonize and come in, and then on top of it if you're drumming. So there have been some people who studied how this impacts well-being, how it lowers blood pressure, how it generally has very measurable health effects for people as well. So this is how this one goes. Mamwe mashko gabwe hanish na bekwe wa dan sakanongan sag no natsagage bochting epicina gamoye dan sakanongan sag no natsagage Mamwe mashko gabwe hanish na bekwe wa dan sakanongan sag no natsagage Ochting epicina gamoying, dan sakanongan sag, no naksagage. But we sometimes can just sing it for a really long time. Keep going. So, but I will stop there and see if people have questions. Hopefully I've given you some sense of the directions that you can go when you're studying language and when you're looking for maybe science in stories and trying to pull pieces back together that got separated somehow. Do you guys have questions, or do you all want to learn a song? Actually, another thing I could do is, if I can get out of here, and find, because you might not want to learn a song in public. I understand, not everyone wants to just...
You should not make them all do a round dance. Right?
I should have made you do a round dance. You want to do a round dance? I could sing you a round dance song. Let's see. I've done it. You know I have. Will it go to? Yeah, okay. So this is actually the website that I run. And so when you all go back wherever you go and talk to someone who's not here with you right now, and you say, hey, you want to learn a song? You can go to this site. It's just ojibwe.net. It's really easy to remember. And you can go to songs. And we have a lot of things on here that help us preserve the language. And when you go to songs, oh, I can't use this mouse. Do I have to use this? There we go. You can find all the songs that we have with the stories and with the sound and the words and everything. So you can practice singing Anishinaabe songs and the practicing your own. Or you can say, next time you have a lit class and you need to say something about Jane Johnston's Schoolcraft, you can say, how about I learn to sing the song she wrote as a lullaby, right? You know? So there's all our songs are on there. We put them there, and I can tell people use them because I think right now we have something like 4,200 users, and I do all kinds of stats on it, and I can see which things people click on. This is actually one they click on a lot because I think people know Henry Schoolcraft, and then they think, oh, Jane Schoolcraft. Her mom is the one who inspired the Longfellow stories, the Song of Hiawatha, and they start making literary connections but then see it in a different way. This song is actually about when she had to send her kids to Michigan all the way out east, probably, over on this side of the country to go to school. So, do you guys have thoughts or comments or questions? Yes?
When you were talking about you were naming the moon, is it grandmother? Was one of the...
We would say a lot of things. So,
Okay.
like, old ladies call the moon Nokomis Nibagisus, and like a lot of people I know still have moon ceremonies. Like my kids have probably gone to some old lady's potluck once a month all their lives, because that's really a tradition that has come back. So a lot of women refer to the moon as Nokomis Nibagisus, which is actually Niba relates sleep and water kind of together, and a lot of things about the subconscious, like the word for mermaids are Nibaneke. So things that are related to water and the subconscious often have that in there. So when you hear Nokomis Nibagisus, that's that grandmother moon in a ceremonial sense, but then you can also say Debikagisus, which is the night sun.
I was
Yeah.
just curious
Yeah.
because the word is used, as you know, in Erdrich.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I don't know. Does Eric say no comes Nabagizis or
No, she uses,
Debicizis?
but it's the grandmother's, that's what you call grandmother,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So-
yeah. But so there isn't a word for moon. There's just Gizis is sun, and then Debicizis is the son of the dark, or the night sun. So you get a sense that they are, obviously, they appear at opposite times. So again, just in the words, there's a lot of science in there. So. Yes?
You said that it's much easier to teach younger children the language. I think that's
Well,
true.
anybody that's not worried or nervous, it's easy to teach.
Are there any attempts, or do you know of anything like to have something like immersion schools that are bilingual schools, or anything on the reservations or anything? Is there any attempts at those?
Yeah, so the one nice thing about having a very narrow area of focus, I probably know every teaching program for this language. I couldn't even begin to tell you a lot of the other. I know there are many, many, many other languages that are the Miami, notably the Dene have some. Just for our language, there are 4 that I know of that are doing quite well. The Bognagijic School in Minnesota, the Wadukading School in Hayward, Wisconsin. Wikwemikong First Nation in Ontario has their elementary school has immersion classes. And then on Walpole Island, which is right between Michigan and Ontario, they also have some courses that are full immersion. It ranges. It's an interesting thing because almost any kid today is just going to get all around them. I mean, you've got not only English, you've got Dora the Explorer doing Spanish too. I mean, they're getting multiple languages, most kids today, in a lot of different directions. So trying to have a full first language only environment, you probably could only get up in like Moose Factory anymore or something. There are some places in Canada though where, especially for Ojibwe, which is related enough to ours, that it is, a child would only hear that language. They've got radio stations and enough media even support that everybody in the community is using.
But
Not too much.
bilingualism is a good strategy. You can't
Yes.
expect that, yes.
Right, yeah. I mean, bilingual is really actually, for us, what we have to kind of shoot for. I think that most parents get very concerned if the other thing I would say, which is like a much longer answer, but our language really collapsed in the mid-1800s. So even now, there are whole things like DVD. I don't have a word for that. There's all kinds of things that we don't have words for. When I'm sitting at home we're having a day at home where we're only using the language. We describe it, but we end up kind of talking in circles in ways that we know what we're saying to each other, but there are not shared terms for a lot of modern concepts right now. So that's definitely something where we would need to catch up. 2 years ago, I was part of a camp where we tried to teach 7th graders the concept of photosynthesis in the language, which really challenged us. We had to come up with a lot of mathematical and scientific terms that we had not had to use previously. So once you get to about 5th, 6th grade, there's a lot of work that some very fluent people would need to do to catch us up. Another really good example is I was teaching a class near Detroit where a lot of the students were mixed African American and Native American, or they were just African American or Caucasian in the class. And the word for African American, I will just say and hope I'm not offending anyone, is not particularly nice. It's very, very blunt and color-based, and the kids in the class wouldn't say it. They're like, that's kind of mean, we don't want to say that. Even our word for Americans is long knives. My daughter won't say that to her friends. I don't want to call my friends long knives. They're not coming at me with knives. So we have things in terms of even political correctness that people in the early 1800s were just describing things in ways that now we would do differently. In the end, we worked with the students in the class. We figured the students who had as their identity African American and Native American should be the ones who kind of shaped what we used. And they decided they wanted to say, the ones that live in a black way. Because a lot of them said, well, we don't happen to actually come from Africa. Don't use Africa in our name. Just say we live in a black way. So that was what was empowering to them. So we use that now in Michigan and the Detroit area, but it changes.
talk more about your journey as a poet? You were saying how when you got your MFA, you were working with professors and you just had a hard time finding your voice. And I mean, because it's pretty extraordinary to write bilingually for all the historical reasons. But can you say a little bit more about how you...
Well, very specifically, I had Robert Bly and Michael Dennis Brown. So if you look up their work, they were men who were concerned with empowering the male voice at the time, in the forest, no less. And so I had a bunch of male poets around me who were going out into the woods and being natural and writing great poems. But as someone who grew up in the city and went to the woods and felt comfortable and connected to the woods, it was very different to suddenly see that voice in that space in a very dominant way, in a way that kind of, you just couldn't imagine how to compete with that. I mean, really, how do you compete with Robert Bly? He is who he is. You can't be that. And it took me a while to learn that you don't have to try to be, I couldn't be Billy Collins either. I couldn't be Gertrude Stein. I might like to be Beckett, maybe. You know, I think that everybody finds a different influence. I think that, as Gerald Bisner has written, our language is naturally more imagistic, and the sound patterns, the number of vowels, and the way that things pattern themselves does something very different. Maybe Wallace Stevens is closer as a model. So it just happened that the type of poetry modeled for me, even at the time, was not probably the most useful. If I were teaching a creative writing class now, you know, I typically begin with things, asking people to think about your writing style and various writing styles and search through those first rather than just look at what's the dominant thing nationally, maybe, I guess. So for me, I think it also is the truth that I was enrolled in courses where you can pass the course, but you're not comfortably fluent. You know, you can do in the classroom things that get assigned to you, but then you're sitting around the fire and an old lady tells a dirty joke and you think, I don't get it. You know, that was my goal for a while. It was like, make sure that no jokes would be told around me that I did not understand. And then when I did defend my PhD thesis, Jim Northrup showed up. This is a funny story. This is why you should all go to grad school, because it's far easier than you think. And in the end, after you write about the thing you love, you don't have to take yourself so seriously anymore. I had all these serious committee members, and they were going to say whether I was done and I should pass or not. And Jim Northrup, who is a well-known Anishinaabe writer, just said he wanted to show up. He wanted to be there because I was writing about him, so he wanted to be there. And I think they didn't know what to do. This old Indian guy wanted to show up. They're like, okay, let him sit there. So he says, wait, I need you all to say something before we begin. And they're all like, oh, okay, it must be something really sacred or like a prayer or something. So he says, Nigi Bogit. Can you all say that? And they all say it back. They say, Nigi Bogit. And for the rest of the whole thing, they're asking me questions, but I'm laughing in my head because they all just one by one said, I just farted, I just farted. So even if only for that reason, you know, your language gives you places to be that you sometimes need. So for us, we had that, sharing that language was a way that he could say, look, even if they all know a lot more than you know right now, you know a few things they don't know, you know. So it was a way to kind of laugh. So, yeah.
Did they ask what that meant?
You know what? Only one of them asked. Now, isn't that interesting, too? The rest of them, it was so serious, and they felt they had done a good Anishinaabe. They never even asked. Only one. She asked me, what did I say afterwards? And I told her. I said, you said she's so smart. No, no, I told her the truth. That would be very bad karma to lie about what words mean. Somebody would catch you. So, you guys have other questions? No? Yeah?
You said that there's that letter, and is the writing the same, or has it been altered? I don't know if that makes any sense. Is the orthography the same for?
Oh yeah, it's beautifully the same. It's amazingly the same. I can straight up read it. Yeah. I mean, you can look up what Warren wrote in 1825 about the Prairie du Chien treaty, and this big, long, eloquent page after page, both languages. And other than that, it sounds the same way. If any of you guys, what would that be? Your maybe three greats or four greats grandparents, the way they would talk slightly differently. So there's ways that it sounds just a bit more formal in some of the syntax, and in a few ways the word choice is a tell of someone being a little formal. But other than that, it's the exact same thing. And sometimes I've done funny things. I used to teach with an old guy who grew up in one place, and he thought it was the center of the universe, as we all think the place where we grew up is the center of the universe, right? And so he said, no one says bonjour. You people over there are making that up. You got that from the French. And I always say we did not get that from the French. Do you remember the rabbit, when a bonjour, the tail, that whole thing? Abozo is to tremble. So when a bonjour has his name because his tail trembles, and we all said bonjour to each other as a greeting, because then I would know, oh, you're somebody that knows the when a bonjour story. And when the Jesuits showed up and they all said bonjour, we must almost have had a laugh. Bonjour, bonjour, like it would have sounded really hilarious. But a lot of people over on the East stopped using bonjour as a greeting in, as far as I can tell, about 1860s, 1870s. So some of them now insist that it's not a word, it's not real. And it was just so delightfully fun when I found some letters from the late 1870s where they were using bonjour from that reservation. So people were going off to war and writing home from that very same area where people no longer said that word. It was a word we still in some places use, but it had, I guess the other implication is that sometimes when people say, well, this is our dialect and this is our dialect, sadly, when people got separated and told to stay in one place, the language did the same thing. So just the way you all probably have favorite words, and every community or town has words that are common or favorites, they got separated, and one community kind of held on to bonjour and another community didn't. There's things like that where now, as we start to remember the bigger Anishinaabe and diaspora, how we all actually connect, I think we connect some of that up. So, what else? I've been asked everything, seriously. You can't ask anything I haven't probably heard once. I don't know. Or try. You guys are a quiet bunch. Don't you even have any questions? I always like when, I wish my daughter was here because I would make her sing a song with me. Yeah.
As a child, what was the influence of the language in your home?
Nothing at all. Honestly, I can remember when I first started wanting to learn the language, there would often be things that were like frighteningly disturbing. Like there were a lot of really amazing Native American leaders who were obviously like changing things and making people really wake up and recognize American Indian issues, American Indian rights. And I was in Minneapolis where a lot of that was going on. And I can remember going to a dinner. It was a big feast, and this elder that we all really respected was asked to say the prayer. And he got up to say the prayer, and he said, Bejik nish niswe niwen nana igadoswe nishwaswe bedoswe. And then, oh, okay. And all he did was count. And because I had had a little bit, I realized that's what was happening. So it was profoundly sad that boarding school had totally stolen the language to the point where he didn't know how to pray. He just counted. And that no one else knew. Stuff like that, you're like, oh, it's just mind-numbing that I think things like that were what made those of us who teach the language now say, that can't happen. We can't collapse. When you guys think of, I don't know what, you almost have something you say before you take the final, right? Some little prayer to some God somewhere. That some set of words that empowers you to do well in life and to live well. And just think if someone took that from you. You can't remember it, So I think for a whole generation, really, most people under 50 didn't grow up hearing any of it, didn't hear complete sentences. At funerals, you would sometimes hear things. or at maybe weddings, traditional ones, you'd hear things. But otherwise, we didn't hear much. And then the Native Languages Act in the 1990s made it legal finally to actually publish the language. So I was working at University of Minnesota Press. We actually had a dictionary that had been written up by John Nichols, but because it was technically still illegal in the US to publish in native languages, they didn't publish it till after that act. So we had a whole period of time where it just wasn't used. And then things really started to happen more after the 90s, but then, the question remains, is that too late? We'll see. Some days I think it's not. Some days I wonder. You really have to use it. I try to make my kids text in Anishinaabe and they do. They usually do, Probably just so their friends don't know what they're saying or that they're texting their mom. But it's, as with anything, your language that you can communicate can define you and can define the other people who are a part of you. And so when we have that, we can do that. What else? Yeah.
Is there an alphabet for the language?
Well, that's another thing. I have to try not to go overboard. Professors, we can make every question take about 40 minutes, right? So we would say, my poetic self would say the landscape is kind of the alphabet, that when we were speaking, the ways the words connect, some core concepts repeat over and over. So when everything was oral, the way it was remembered was through landscape and constellations, and so the way things connect up and the way even verbs are conjugated and built out, some of those patterns are really interesting and echo into a Four Seasons kind of environment really well. Pictographs were the first things, and those also, you can see some pictographs at Sanilac and Hegman Lake, different areas in the Great Lakes where they literally represent things in the sky. And then there would be sticks that people would record, recipes, prayers, and things, but they were all in images. So one might imagine that had we not encountered the Roman alphabet, we would have come up with something more like calligraphy. That's one thing that I would say. So we probably would have gone from orality to more sophisticated forms of visual image representation. However, we ended up encountering the Roman alphabet. So when the Jesuits showed up and when the exploration on the Hudson Bay area started in really by the mid-1500s, the language was being recorded with the Roman alphabet. So from then on, we've had a very easy time with orthography. Some people use syllabics, but that actually is a linguist who came along later and worked with the community to represent sounds more efficiently. So we have some common consonant pairs like ZH, zh. Not a common thing in Roman English or Romance language alphabets, but you could make one little, triangle and a dot and represent sounds differently. But that syllabics actually came hundreds of years after people had already been representing the language with the Roman alphabet. So most people now use the Roman alphabet. We had a big conference of teachers a while back where people debated syllabics, the alphabet back and forth, and it's just plain easier to set up a website when you're using the alphabet that's used around more. So we stick with that.